Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you all. And I hope we'll get to have discussion even though I'm remote, not there in person. So today I'm going to talk about some observations and particularly on the theme of cross-scale fluxes. And so just before I really begin, I find satellite images like this one really inspiring. And those are one of the sorts of images that got me interested in oceanography and geophysical fluid dynamics. And so what you're looking at here, this is off the coast of California, a satellite image showing chlorophyll with the darker greens being higher chlorophyll concentrations. And what stands out to me is that it's very clear that the ocean circulation is shaping the biology of this system. And some of the features that are particularly interesting to me is the question of how far offshore is this really high chlorophyll reaching? And these really small scale features asking, are those the lateral redistribution or is there vertical velocity associated with those? And both of these questions really are questions about what's happening at the large scale and this regional scale, but also what's really happening at the scale of fronts. And so today I'll talk about what are the dynamics that predominate at the submesoscale, so at the kilometer scale, and then what are the implications of these observations for cross-scale kinetic energy fluxes and for ecosystems. And so only very recently have we even had the ability to observe ocean currents at these submesoscales. And some of the questions that we're now able to answer have to do with energy cascades. And so they're in both observations and models. Relatively recently, we've had evidence of a forward energy cascade. And I'm going to show a few plots like this, where positive is flux of energy to smaller scales, and negative is flux of energy to larger scales, so an inverse cascade. And so these are observations on the left-hand side from the Gulf of Mexico, from drifters, showing that there's seasonality, paper led by Drupal in the energy cascade with a forward energy cascade happening at smaller spatial scales in the summertime, and also a weaker magnitude compared with the winter time. And on the right, you see a similar calculation, but from a model, also of the Gulf of Mexico. And in the model, they're able to decompose the mechanisms that lead to forward energy cascade, and they hypothesize using this model, which is a 500-meter grid spacing. And so an effective resolution that will be about 5 times larger than that. That divergence is important across all spatial scales for the forward energy cascade, while strain becomes important at smaller spatial scales. We haven't had the ability to directly observe velocity at these 500-meter spatial scales until relatively recently. And so I use observations from an instrument called DOPVIS, which is part of the SIO mass package. You can read more about the instrument in particular in a paper we published in Geophysical Research Letters led by my collaborator, Luc Linane. This is mounted on an airplane, and we get direct velocity observations from Doppler shift of surface gravity waves, and co-located with a number of other observations, including wave properties, sea surface temperature, and ocean color, which allows us to investigate chlorophyll. And I'm going to show just one snapshot example of those observations. So we were sampling off the California current system. We were sampling a cold and dense upwelling filament here. These are observations from the S-mode submesoscale ocean dynamics field campaign. And in this particular area, we took velocity observations, and here velocity and sea surface temperature under the airplane track. And we can zoom in again on one of these fronts in the lower panel. And so here I'm showing just a 4-kilometer snapshot of our observations, where you can see that the relative vorticity and color here is the same order as the Coriolis parameter, suggesting that we're in a regime within submesoscale and nonlinear dynamics. And so one of the first things I did when I got these observations was just look at what is the kinetic energy spectrum. And some of the power of these observations is that we have this 500-meter resolution, but it's also nearly synoptic across 100-kilometer spatial scales. And so here I'm showing observations from two field campaigns, one in green in the frontal region that I was just showing you, and then an eddying region in blue, and compared that to the ship that was under the plane. In the eddying region, we have similar spectra at larger scales, but the planes are allowing us to push to smaller spatial scales. And the spectrum here is about a k to the -2, and there are a number of dynamics that could explain a k to the -2 spectral slope. So it could be attributed to internal waves, fronts, or surface quasi-geostrophy. One thing that stands out is that these observations are helping us to push beyond the resolution of regional scale models. Here I'm showing a MIT GCM 2-kilometer model resolution, the same kinetic energy spectrum. And we just see that these observations are below are bringing us to smaller spatial scales than the effective resolution of the model. And so they will hopefully be useful in informing models and what dynamics are missing from those models. And so to better understand the dynamics, one of the methods that's rapidly become fairly established is to do a wave vortex decomposition. And so that's to take the velocity and decompose it into a stream function and a velocity potential. And so normally you would need 2D observations to do this. But Oliver Buehler and co-authors have developed a spectral method to do this, where you can decompose the spectrum into a stream function and a velocity potential. And here I'm showing observations in the California current system where they did just that and found that the divergent component becomes relatively more important at smaller spatial scales compared to larger spatial scales. But one of the major assumptions of this method is that the velocity stream function and potential are uncorrelated. And that is because this method relies on the cross spectrum between the along track and a cross-track velocity. And you can just think of that as the U and V components of velocity. Conveniently, the plane observations that I'll be showing you today were nearly straight east-west lines. But at the submesoscale, we actually don't expect that the stream function and potential will be uncorrelated with each other. We expect, for example, that there will be frontogenesis driven by a geostrophic strain field that will result in ageostrophic velocities that have divergence and vertical velocity associated with them. But we can use this and test for correlation between the stream function and potential. And so if this correlation between, if this cross spectrum between the along track and a cross track velocities is complex, then we can say that the stream function and potential are likely correlated with each other. And so if we take our two observational cases, the eddying case on the left-hand side and the frontal case on the right-hand side, here I'm showing coherence, and so they both have significant coherence across nearly all spatial scales that were sampled. And now I'm showing phase, and so if the phase is around 0 or 180, that's real and purely imaginary at plus or minus 90 degrees. And so what we see is that there's a transition where where this cross correlation between the long track and a cross track velocity is nearly real to where it becomes complex as we go to smaller spatial scales. And that transition happens at about 10 kilometers in our eddying case and just 6 kilometers in this particular frontal observations. And so this is telling us although we had a continuous spectral slope about a k to the -2, we are seeing a transition in the dynamics at submesoscale of a 10 kilometer to 6 kilometer spatial scale. And so that allows us to rule out one mechanism for the k to the -2 spectrum at the smallest spatial scales, which is internal waves. If we just had linear internal waves, then we wouldn't see this correlation between the divergent and rotational part of the flow. And then we asked, could this be attributed to surface quasi-geostrophy? And so I ran a number of simulations with a surface quasi-geostrophic model to look at for this correlation and looked at the cross-spectral density. And I found that in all of the simulations, the real component of the cross-spectral density had larger magnitude than the imaginary in a similar parameter regime to the observations. And in contrast, the observations show a transition, as I said, to an imaginary component of the cross-spectrum at about 6 kilometer spatial scale. And so our conclusion is that ageostrophic frontal dynamics are the dominant dynamics at the observed scales in the California current system. And so one of the really nice things then that we can do with the observations, and this is really exciting, is to compute the kinetic energy fluxes. And so this plot I'm showing here, so on the bottom, I'm showing just a snapshot of the observations where we have sea surface temperature at a front. And above, I'm showing velocity gradients in the black lines, where I'm showing strain, divergence, and vorticity. And so right at the front, we have convergence, large strain, and also cyclonic relative vorticity. In green, I'm showing frontogenesis, and so this front is frontogenetic at the moment that we observed it. And then we can use coarse graining to look at the kinetic energy flux, and we find that the kinetic energy flux is significantly positive right at the front. And so these are some of the first direct observations of kinetic energy flux being localized at Submesoscale, and really direct observations of kinetic energy flux in the ocean. And so we can tie this together actually with what I was showing with the cross spectrum. So we find that this Reynolds stress, here, this is a filtered cross correlation between the U and V velocities, or the along track and a cross track velocity. We find that it's this term, which is associated with the shear strain as well, that drives the magnitude of the kinetic energy flux, actually regardless of the sign across all observations. We also find at the tails of our observations, larger kinetic energy fluxes that have been seen in model 500 meter resolution models or similar observations. And so quickly, I want to tie this back to the chlorophyll. And one of the reasons that we really care what's happening right at front. So one of the reasons was energy fluxes, but another is fluxes of carbon and biological communities. And so one of the things I do in my research is not only study the geophysical fluid dynamics, but study the implications for microbial community composition. And so here I'm showing observations from a slightly different region, from the Western Mediterranean Sea. I collected microbial community observations in California current. I'm currently working on plotting them. But here, what I want to point out is that we sampled across a number of fronts and a number of different water masses, from inflowing Atlantic water to a anticyclonic eddy to the eastern part of our observational domain. And then this water mass called modified Atlantic water that mixes the resident Mediterranean seawater and the Atlantic water that's recently come into the domain. And you can see that they're separated in temperature salinity space. When we look at them in biological space, what we see is there are two main things that I want to point out. The first is that we had this eddy to the east that had high chlorophyll associated with it. And we find that actually the majority of those high chlorophyll samples have very similar community to the inflowing Atlantic water mass. And so that's suggesting to me that this filament has really just been stirred into there, that there's not a lot of dynamic vertical velocity going on that's caused high chlorophyll in this spiral pattern. But the other thing I want to point out is that all the frontal samples cluster together. And this was really interesting to me because our frontal samples were not next to each other. And so what this is suggesting to me is that we see frontal communities, that in fronts, we see a unique community, and that is suggestive of vertical velocity being relatively important in generating a unique frontal community and really a unique biogeochemical environment. And so what I've shown here is a new use of cross-spectrum in oceanography to determine dynamics from velocity observations. What we found is that there's a predominance of ageostrophic frontal dynamics at the observed submesoscale features. We're able to demonstrate that forward kinetic energy flux is localized at fronts and is associated with strain and velocity covariance, and that physical forcing can drive significant local and regional changes in community composition and biodiversity.
Cool. All right, questions from Mara?
Thank you. It's a nice talk, actually. So you explained that during winter, that is the frontogenesis is more, because that is when you get the higher, smaller scale to the, larger scale to the smaller scale. Am I understood correctly?
Yeah, so that was from Dhruv Balwada's work, where he shows that in the winter time in the Gulf of Mexico, which is when you have deeper mixed layers. Let me see if I can go back to that one. Here we are. Yeah, so in the winter time, when there's deeper mixed layers and larger, and the scale of the submesoscale is larger, he finds that there is a larger magnitude of the forward kinetic energy flux.
And what drives this forward energy flux? Is it some sort of instability that causes due to the deeper mixed layer, or you have because of the slope in the thermocline or something?
Yeah, so that's what we think, and yeah, this is a wonderful paper by Dhruv. But one of the limitations is that it's just drifters. So I didn't have in situ observations, and so I think that's the power of one of the things I was able to show by having these collocated observations and direct velocity observations, where we're able to look at what might be the mechanisms that are causing forward kinetic energy flux, and from that we're suggesting, yes, likely dynamics that lead to phronogenesis, and so yeah, there are a number of different submesoscale instability mechanisms that can lead to forward energy cascade, things like symmetric instability, move energy to turbulent scales.
Yeah, thank you.
So I have a question. A couple of times during the talk, you mentioned, something about the model, and then you showed a plot with like the kinetic energy spectrum from MIT GCM. Was there a modeling component that was meant to be part of this research? And if so, can you talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, so this particular paper does not have a modeling component to it, but I do use a lot of process study models in my work, and I am currently working on a modeling study that's related to observations from this platform with slightly different science questions, but related to these, right, understanding what are some of the mechanisms that underlie, in particular, air-sea coupling at submesoscale.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
You showed that flux calculation in physical space localized along the front. Now those flux calculations require a lot of points. If you did it with fewer points, it's easy to see in a numerical simulation. If you computed the flux with a few number of points, your total flux would be very different from what you get if you had a converged high number of points. So can you explain how you made sure that you had sufficient number of points to get a converged flux?
Yeah, okay. So I think, so the kinetic energy flux here, this is the blue line with the shading. And so the shading is using a conservative estimate of our error from the velocity observations. And this is a triple correlation. So so we propagate a lot of error in computing the kinetic energy flux. And so it is exciting that we see any significantly positive at all, given that we were so conservative about the errors. But this is a localized flux, right? I think the issue that you're mentioning has to do with cascades, and that is, so here, this is a heat map showing kinetic energy flux, and it's compared with strain, although that's not particularly relevant for answering your question. And as you're saying, right, so this is, we're spanning 4 orders of magnitude here. And so this is a kinetic energy flux. Really, it occurs in hotspots. And that's important to keep in mind. And it's one of the reasons from these observations, I haven't computed a cascade because I wasn't confident that we had converged. Instead, I was fairly careful to say it's just flux from these observations that I have. But the average flux over the domain, I agree with you, would be quite variable.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question if somebody has one. Okay, well, let's thank Mara again.
Yeah, and thank you all, and thank you to the organizers for organizing this and for your flexibility.